We are recording. So we had three conversation points on the table. Why so much emphasis placed on this notion of Black nationalism by Malcolm X? What distinctions were you able to draw between hearing the speech and reading the speech? And then finally, what new understandings or new revelations were you able to uncover about Malcolm X through the engagement of his work? Who would like to start us off in discussing what was talked about in your breakout groups?
One thing we discussed in regards to nationalism was I brought up the fact that he was just probably tired of the fracturing of the Black community between Muslims and Christians, and just trying to say, set aside your religious differences, recognize your common history, your common enemy, your common goals, controlling your economy. And so sort of just establishing a new Black nationalism based on the common fact that everyone's Black.
Absolutely. Great call out, Jelani. Um, kind of um, kind of reminiscent of what Glissant was up to with his ideas of forging forms of unity around the abyss. Absolutely. Did anybody's group discuss either the distinctions between reading the speech and hearing the speech, or just new understandings of Malcolm's that were uncovered through the engagement of his work? Remy, what did they talk about in your group?
I think like like hearing the speech brought it to life more, and we were able to understand his emphasis on certain parts, and also the audience
Yeah.
when they were like cheering and stuff when he
Yeah.
was saying things really helped.
I agree too. I think for me, the biggest difference is the audience, right? And you can see how um, the how his message is translating and the responses that it's invoking. So you're absolutely right about the audience. So great call out. Anybody want to speak to just a new understanding of Malcolm that was produced by reading or watching his speech? Yeah. Just looking at the chat, Jalen was saying that the audience was like clapping and responding about every 10 seconds. Absolutely. Yeah, Malcolm was very charismatic. And also, like, if you pay close attention, he had a great sense of humor. Like, there's a lot of, like, he was clowning. He was talking a lot of shit within what he was doing.
That was, what I got from the audio, of course, is, his ability to control the crowd with, using the sense of humor when he needed to bring everybody back, and then come with the seriousness the next sentence. And then also another thing I had about just a new understanding is just, you forget just how much of a astute politician he was, political scientist, world politics. He obviously had a complete understanding of the U.S. political system, and able to break down Russian issues, Chinese, just on a whim, just, they're not doing this there, and just sort of educating everybody at the same time.
Absolutely. And do it in a way that it was not lost on anyone. Everybody understood exactly what he's talking about. Great call out, Jelani. Thank you, man. Cassandra, could you speak to a little bit more what you put in the chat? Because I think you're touching on something that's important.
Yeah, I noticed he has a different approach. Like, I know MLK was nonviolent, whereas I'm not sure if Malcolm was like, let's use violence, but it was definitely like, let's not work together. Like, we need to reshape the understanding of what nationalism looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of like saying, oh, American nationalism, let's call it Black nationalism, and like rewrite ideas of community.
Cassandra, you bring up a good point as far as your distinction between American nationalism and Black nationalism. When I get through my notes, I'm going to circle back to that. So please don't let me forget, because that's a very good point. What I want to do now, I'm going to show a quick, like, 8 to 10 minute video, and then we'll go into my notes. As I think I mentioned before, I had like a visual methods course for my PhD, and we had to do like these visual projects. And I had to do what's called a visual essay. And I used this speech to kind of scaffold my essay and some of the problematics within the speech. So we'll watch that just to provide some further context. Then I'll go into my notes, and then we'll go from there. And can everyone see the black screen?
Yeah, we could see it.
I bet. Okay, 1 second. November 3rd, 1983. I began the process of understanding my place in the world. From the moment I opened my eyes, I began to collect and analyze data. Ontological understandings began to shape who I understood myself to be: son, grandson, nephew, male, black, black, black.
Black.
Blackness in the Western context presents various particularities and nuanced constrictions. Blackness enables creative and dynamic possibilities to transcend these nuanced constrictions. Acts of rebellion, subversion, integration, political participation. Some acts have been more effective than others. The vote has always been positioned as the ideal way to address these nuanced constrictions placed on the Black experience. How effective has electoral politics been in addressing these constrictions? Has it alleviated Black pain and suffering, what Frank Wooderson calls perpetual death? In 1870, the 15th Amendment outlawed voter discrimination, encouraging Black male voter participation. Harun Rose Rebels became the first Black man elected to the U.S. Senate.
Black. I'm black.
America would respond to this progress with Jim Crow laws and Black codes, nullifying any notion of progress. Almost a century later, on August 6, 1965, the Voter Rights Act was passed, seeking to do what the 15th Amendment was meant to do: protect Black men and women this time in their efforts to vote. This was widely celebrated as a great civil rights victory. Within 5 days of this victory, police brutality incited a 5-day rebellion in Watts, California.
The government has failed us. You can't deny that. Anytime you live in the 20th century, 1964, and you walking around here singing, "We shall overcome," the government has failed.
It's only a man, not God. It's only a man, not God.
In 1993, the Black community celebrated the first Black president. He even appeared on the Arsenio Hall show to play saxophone.
It's play in our lives. And until we become politically mature, we will always be misled, led astray, or deceived or maneuvered into supporting someone politically who doesn't have the good of our community at heart.
Hey, Clinton! Our people are still in jail for their crime. Mandatory minimum. Do you want to take pictures of our people here? We're still in jail for what you did.
In 2009, the Black community was actually able to celebrate the election of a real Black president. Everyone was hopeful for the change, and the Black community envisioned the beginning to the end of their pain and suffering. In February of 2012, the hope for change was shattered. 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was hunted and murdered. The Stand Your Ground law allowed for the acquittal of Trayvon's killer, birthing the Black Lives Matter movement. November 3rd, 2020. As I celebrated the day of my birth, I observed the world anxiously anticipate the removal of the Trump administration, which can be argued would be accomplished in large part due to the work of Stacey Abrams, Latasha Brown, and 91% of Black women who turned out not only to flip the state of Georgia, but to be a major contributing factor in placing the Biden-Harris administration in the White House.
When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro.
More questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't Black.
How will this administration address Black pain and suffering more effectively than the 45 previous administrations? Will the Black community continue to succumb to political theater? Only time can provide the answer, yet history provides great insight. While electoral politics has advanced the constrictions at a civil rights level, electoral politics has yet to produce any type of sanctuary for the systemic subjugation of the Black body, failing to address the constrictions on a human rights level.
I'm black. Black.
All right, so let's just provide a little further context to the speech and some of the issues that the speech is problematizing. Are there any questions about anything before I jump into my notes? All right, bet. So I think Jelani hit it on the head in the sense of the emphasis placed on Black nationalism, right? He starts off by saying, you know, I'm going to leave my religion at home, right? We're going to focus on our experiences as Black people and allow that to be our unifying factor. For me, this is very in line with how Pan-Africanism envisions the unity of African people, right? So we're not going to focus on the things that separate or differentiate African people, be it language, be it ethnic regions or ethnic backgrounds, but we're going to focus on the fact that we're all African, and that's going to be our unifying force, right? But also Malcolm says that re-education has to be fundamental to establishing this idea of Black nationalism. Re-education from a political standpoint, re-education from an economic standpoint. Now, if we are to focus on this economic standpoint for a moment, keep in mind, this is Malcolm post Nation of Islam, right? He's already been removed from the nation. But his memory of the nation has not left him, right? And when you talk about the Nation of Islam, this is an organization that has its base in Chicago, particularly the south side of Chicago. And you think about the economic power base that Malcolm is articulating, this is very much informed by the economic power base that the Nation of Islam has in the south side of Chicago. So in the early to mid to late 60s, right, just really this whole decade, and even later into the 70s, businesses in the sense of cleaners, diners, restaurants, dentistries, anything that you can think of, the Nation of Islam had these businesses within the Black community. So when Malcolm is talking about the Black dollar and the power of the Black dollar, this is not imaginative, right? This is very much informed by a practical reality of what he witnessed through the Nation of Islam in Chicago, right? Underpinning the speech, you have messages and themes of self-help, agency, international questions of liberation, right? So he's thinking more not only about the experience of African people within the United States, but he's thinking globally, right? He's thinking about the anti-colonial liberation struggles that's happening throughout the world as well. And due to this, right, because keep in mind, Malcolm is also returning from his travels in Africa. So, and he spent time with anti-colonial African heads of state. So this is informing the way that he's not only looking at the world, but also America, right? And him being able to witness the living conditions of African people under colonialism, right, allows him to be informed to the reality that African people here in America are also experiencing a colonial experience, right? It allows him to view America as a colony. In fact, he makes the claim that there's no such thing as a second-class citizen. What is that? Second-class citizen is a slave, right? Second-class citizen equals colonization. So he's making this equation that, one, America is operating as a colony, and African people within America are colonized, okay? And again, it's very much informed by his travels abroad, okay? We cannot escape his critique of neoliberalism and his critique of the neoliberal capture on the March on Washington. This is where he says, you know, they got you marching between two dead men, Lincoln and Washington, singing "We Shall Overcome," right? But if you know the history of the March on Washington, When it was originally organized by SNCC and groups like the SCLC, it had a much more radical temperature to it than what was presented on the day of the march. What happens is the liberals get involved, the government gets involved, the Democrats get involved, and they start to mitigate how the march will take place. They start to dictate the roads that they will march on. Any speech that will be delivered has to go through them to determine if this is sufficient enough, right? Or maybe not sufficient is not the right word. If it's not as radical as it may have been, right? So you want to keep this tone down. And this is what he's saying, this idea that the liberals are really controlling this march on Washington. Does everybody understand when I say liberals who I'm referring to? Does anybody need further clarification on that? All right. He shifts the conversation from the liberals to a focus on politics and the focus on political power and the political immaturity of African people. And this immaturity in Malcolm's assessment stems from the inability to hold politicians accountable, right? So when it's election time, they'll say everything that you want to hear to garner your vote. But once they're placed in office, none of that was promised comes to fruition, right? So we now sit here a year with Biden in office. If you guys think about the months leading up to the election and the campaigning that Biden did, as the video showed, you've seen him in conversation with Charlemagne the God. You see him trying to appeal to black folks to garner the vote. You see him bringing out Obama, right, to help get the black vote. His running mate, Kamala Harris, right, she's going back to her old alma mater, Howard University. When she's stepping off the jet, she has on her Chuck Taylors, she has on her Timberlands to appeal to the black population, right? She goes on the Breakfast Club and talks about how her favorite person to listen to in college was Tupac, but at the time, Tupac didn't even have a fucking album out, right? But again, trying to appeal to the black vote, right? But now, a year in office, I haven't even fucking seen Kamala Harris. She's ghost, right? Biden ain't did shit for black folks, right? So this is the political immaturity that Malcolm is talking about. They got our vote, but now it's time to cash in on the promises. We cannot hold them accountable. This is the lack of maturity that Malcolm speaks to. He argues and affirms that the Democrats and the Republicans are two sides to the same coin, right? And he says, you know, I know you don't want to hear this. I know you don't like to hear these things, but I have to tell you these things. I'm going to tell you the truth whether you like it or not, is what he says. I will tell you the truth whether you like it or not. To me, this is indicative of who Malcolm X is at his core. And not only the act of telling the truth, right, but of living by this truth. If you know the history of Malcolm X, you could really think of Malcolm in three iterations, right? You have the Malcolm of his youth, which would evolve into Detroit Red. Detroit Red evolving into Malcolm X from going into prison and getting introduced to the Nation of Islam and advocating for the Nation of Islam. That's the second iteration. And then the final iteration is the El-Hajj El-Malik Al-Shabazz, the one who returns back from Mecca, the one who's parted ways from the Nation of Islam, right? In each of those three iterations, it is truth that causes Malcolm to make a shift, right? Because as Detroit Red, he's in the streets of Harlem, he's pimping, he's using drugs, he's moving weight, he's robbing, he's doing all the things that criminals do to survive, right? That was the truth that he lived. He gets locked up, he comes into another form of truth through his brother Filbert, and he's introduced into the truth that is the Nation of Islam. He lets go of his conch. For those that don't know what a conch is, it's when black folks perm their hair to make it look white, just to put it bluntly. He lets that go, right? He leaves the cigarettes alone, he leaves the pork alone, he leaves the white women alone, and he lives this straight and narrow, righteous Muslim life, willing to die for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, right? So this is the second iteration. Truth caused him to shift, right? Then, while as a member of the Nation of Islam, following the tutelage of Elijah Muhammad, willing to die for the Elijah Muhammad, he comes into another truth, a truth that what Elijah Muhammad says he's about, he's not living, right? And Malcolm cannot settle that contradiction, and it causes him to leave the Nation of Islam. While in the Nation of Islam, it's very much preached that white folks can't make it into paradise. White folks can't make a Hajj and make a pilgrimage back to Mecca, right? All white folks is devils, right? Not a devil, but the devil, according to the Nation of Islam, right? So Malcolm defects. He goes to Mecca, makes his Hajj, and while he's on his Hajj, he's seeing people with pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. He sees them on their Hajj. He breaks bread with them. He eats with them. He drinks with them. He lays and rests with them, right? And he realizes that what was taught in the nation is not the truth of Islam. So he has to pivot again, right? So truth is a guiding star for Malcolm, not only to tell the truth, but his decision making is based off of these notions of truth. He also presents collective notions of freedom, right? So he's not focused on solely the African experiences with for those within the American confines of America, but he's looking globally. How can all African people begin to get free? And he also, and I would say like Baldwin, he offers us an apocalyptic prophecy, right? Because if you think back 2 weeks to the work of James Baldwin and the reading that we did entitled The Fire Next Time, and how Baldwin ends the fire next time. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time, right? So in other words, if America doesn't situate their racial problems, then God will come with the fire next time, right? Malcolm's up to the same thing. Black folks have been advocating, organizing, and mobilizing to vote. You gave them the vote, so we have the ballot. This is one means that black folks have to address their grievances, right? This is one methodology to give them equality, right? But if you don't want to take the ballot, America, we got this other option. We got the bullet. So it's up to you on how you want to play this. The prophecy comes in because this is given in 1964. Right? And he tells you America has a racial powder keg. And a racial powder keg is more dangerous than an atomic bomb, is what Malcolm said. A year later, Malcolm is assassinated. After that, the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense is birthed. And then after that, in 1966, you have the Red Summer of 1966, where all the urban cities in America were set ablaze through rebellions and protests due to racial injustice, right? So this is the prophecy of Malcolm's words. They didn't listen to the ballot. So 65 and 66 brought the bullet. Again, the distinction between separating our religious differences and our political reality, right? So Malcolm comes back from Africa and he's organizing what's called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. This is inspired by the African heads of state that liberated their countries, forming the Organization of African Unity, right? So this is how we're going to address our politics here in America, through the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And for our religious and our spiritual address, we'll have the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. So not only in his rhetoric is he talking about the need to separate church and state, if you will, church and politics, right? But he's doing this in his organizing efforts by establishing the Organization of Afro-American Unity for the politics and Muslim Mosque Incorporated for the spiritual and the religious. Again, to Jelani's point, right? The global astuteness of global politics of Malcolm X. He just goes through a portion of the speech where he's just riddling off all the losses of the Western colonial powers, right? He's talking about Vietnam. He's talking about Jomo Kenyatta. He's just going through all of these anti-colonial victories that takes place. And this is informing the way that he's looking at our situation here in the Americas. And this also causes him to shift even the way that he looks at notions of integration. Whereas before, he wanted nothing to do with this idea of integration. Now, I'm not saying that he was in support of integration once he returned and he separated from the Nation of Islam, but how he viewed integration when we get in contact with him is more as a means to the same ends, right? So integration is one avenue that you can take to get our overall freedom. And that's how he looks at it. So that's a shift in his thinking. And I think one of the greatest contributions of Alhaj Malik al-Shabazz was taking the plight of black folks or his attempt to take the plight of black folks and take the United States to the United Nations for the violation of human rights. So let me ask you, the civil rights movement, what were some of the main objectives of the civil rights movement? What are some of the things that they were advocating for? What was the work that Martin Luther King and the SCLC and SNCC, what were they wanting to do?
Voter rights, housing rights, making sure the southern states cooperated with the Constitution.
Right. Okay. So let's break this down. Voting rights, housing rights, where to go to schools, right? Where to eat. These are all civil rights issues. The improvement of the quality of life, right? Civil rights. Okay? Fast forward to our time. We have the movement for Black Lives. We have the Black Lives Matter movement. We have the Black Lives Matter organization. And then we have the term, right? Black Lives Matter. Let's just focus on the term for the moment. Somebody tell me what the term Black Lives Matter means. It's not too deep. Just tell me what it means.
I would say we're all the same. There's like no difference between us.
Does it say that we're all the same? Because I think if they're saying that we're all the same, it would sound like all lives matter, right? So it's very specified. It says Black Lives Matter. So what are they saying about Black life?
Needs to stop being devalued. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just that the lives of Black people are not dispensable.
Okay, thank you, Serena. So let's think about this. If we have a movement that says the lives of Black people should not be dispensable, right? Their lives should matter too. This is what the movement is saying. What does that say? What are the implications of the society that produced this movement? How does the society that produces a movement called Black Lives Matter view Black life?
As less valuable than other lives.
That they don't matter. Thank you, Jelani. Absolutely. So check it. If we know that civil rights are about improving the living conditions of a people, right? And we have this movement that is about the livelihood of a people, is Black Lives Matter in its articulation a civil rights issue or a human rights issue? What do you think? Are they talking about civil rights or human rights? Jelani says human rights. Anybody disagree with Jelani? No, I wouldn't disagree either. It's absolutely a human rights issue. Point blank, period. It's a human rights issue because it's not a question, again, of the quality of life. It's a question of just the ability and the possibility to live, right? So one thing is I see, and I'll use Black Lives Matter because of the term that they use, and it's in our now, right? But a lot of organizations that seek to mobilize, organize, and fight for the livelihood of Black folks are still operating under the guise of civil rights. A lot of the tactics that were used under the civil rights movement are employed for our movements today, right? And I think that's a misstep. I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you guys feel we can advocate for the human rights of African people, juxtaposed to always positioning for the civil rights? What are some demands that could be made that will situate a human rights struggle juxtaposed to a civil rights struggle? No ideas? Okay.
Would reparations be on the human rights side of things?
I would lean that more towards civil rights, Serena, only because paying reparations will do what? It will allow you to have a little bit more money, right? Which will give you a lot more access and make your life a little bit more comfortable, but that will not stop a police from killing you, right? Cassandra says reform in police training and police hiring. Give me a little bit more details, Cassandra.
I think a lot of, or like, I took a sociology class and they said that like in making changes like in the system, like the roots of the system is where the change needs to happen. So I think reforms there. I also think reforms in like education could help as well.
Okay, so with the reform again, would that help the living conditions of Black folks, or would that allow them to live?
Wait, sorry, what was the question?
So with the reforms, so you're saying we got to reform the police, right? Would
Yes.
those reforms allow for the lifestyle of Black folks to be better, or would it allow for Black folks to live?
The second one, or both.
It could be both. It could be both. So let's focus this a little bit more, because you're in the right direction with police reform, right? Why did Black Lives Matter start? What started the Black Lives Matter movement? What was the phenomenon?
Police brutality in general, Ferguson.
And the murder of Black bodies, right?
Correct.
Yep. Ashton said death of George Floyd. The Black Lives Matter predates George Floyd. So the death of Black bodies is what birthed this Black Lives Matter movement, right? So what would be the most sensible thing to ask for that would advocate for the human rights of Black folks? Now that we know what started this movement.
Stop killing Black folks.
Stop fucking killing us. That alone is a way that you could advocate for human rights, right? So in my estimation, if we're gonna do this correctly, and you're talking about legislation, you have to put some type of legislation on the books that will change the ability to just kill Black folks without recourse. I haven't seen that in large scale, right? I haven't. I know that that's what Black Lives Matter is advocating for, but I haven't seen in large, focused, concentrated effort on that. And to me, this is where, again, this idea of political immaturity, it comes into play. So I'll put my notes on pause. We'll jump into our fishbowl. Everyone should know where you're at with the fishbowl. I went over that the last time we met. You should know if you have 2, then you're done for the semester. If you have 1, you have 1 more to go. And if you don't have any, you might want to hop in some of these fish bowls.
One comment, Prof.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I noticed right after George Floyd, the situation. A lot of newspapers ran articles about Malcolm and how he brought this issue to the World Court in the 60s. I think New York Times ran one that next day, and maybe even LA Times. So I just noticed that they went right to Malcolm and how he brought this issue to the world in 64, 65.
Yeah, and I came across some information, and I'm circumventing and talking about it just because of where I got it from. I got it from Instagram. I'm always like, I don't know how accurate or academic that is, but I came across some info that another brother from New York successfully took the United States to the United Nations for crimes against humanity, and they were found guilty on 5 counts. But I need to do further research to see. I need to get like a more authoritative source than Instagram to see if that's real or not. But to me, at the very moment that Malcolm was taken off this planet, that should have been our focus, right? Because another thing that Malcolm says, going at the civil level, right, you're taking the perpetrators of the crime to court who are in bed with the same people, right? You're not going to get justice that way because the people who are running the court systems are in bed with the people who are running the police departments who are doing the crime. So you're not going to find justice there. So you need to go to the higher ups, right? And the higher up would be the United Nations. And I can't understand why no one but this individual Malcolm X have thought to do that. Even after he already put it down on paper, no one has still thought to make a serious attempt at that. Okay. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for Fishbowl? All right, so I'll call that random. If you went, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jasmine. Do you want to volunteer?
Yeah,
Okay.
but I'm not sure how many points I have for.
Okay, I don't know off top also, but we'll have you go, and then if you have more than 2, it's like it's extra. We have Yasmin also raising her hand. Can we get one more volunteer? If not, I'll call that random.
I can go. I know I have a second to do.
Okay. Let me see. Okay, you say you have one to do. Okay, so we'll have it with you, Jelani. Perfect. So we have Yasmin, Jasmine, and Jelani. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
Okay. I guess I'll go first. Just in terms of the speech itself, just talking about Black nationalism being the common thread and, moving forward with, controlling the economy of the communities, controlling every aspect of Black lives and wealth. And then he started talking about, the civil rights movement and bringing that movement to the World Court, which we just discussed. Asking Uncle Sam for civil rights is just a joke. And then he also pointed out the futility of the Cold War. Having nuclear bombs is just cancels each other out. And so he's talking about guerrilla warfare, how, when the fight's brought down to the ground, the white man is heartless. And this is where you can defeat him. Spent time talking about the Dixiecrats, voting for Democrats that are still in cahoots with the Dixiecrats is just throwing away a vote. And so he compared, talked about how Johnson waited 4 years to the end of his term to address civil rights, and then filibustered for 2 months, which is almost the exact same thing that's been going on with the Clinton, even the Obama administration, just trying to play the middle, trying to be bipartisan all the time, and nothing happens when you do that. And I guess, so that's my contemporary analysis, just showing how Uncle Sam failed again with another ground war in Afghanistan, pulling out, calling a truce there. And just a lot about the Black agenda not being addressed, even with Biden and Kamala so far, nothing's being addressed. And filibustering thing just ended. And so I guess, the questions I have are just in terms of Black revolutionaries being far and few between. And we come to the point where we're just accepting the crumbs.
Great question. Yasmin or Jasmine?
The section that caught my eye was when he was told he's not American, about writers not American, and it's just one of the 22 million Black people who are victims of Americanism. And how he also said, just because you're born in America, it doesn't make you American, or like, you know, just how like being like American, you know, it like comes with like specific aspects and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna circle back to that, Jasmine, after Yasmin goes.
I wanted to talk about the topic you were talking about of Black Lives Matter. Like, no one was really aware of that until like more people kept on talking about it, and that's when it became a major issue. But sometimes, like, I felt like, in my opinion, that like people took advantage of that and just like made a bigger issue and making Black folks look even more bad on the Black Matter protest.
Yeah, I would agree with that, right? Like the message got diluted to where they could be positioned as like a irresponsible radical group and not focus on what the circumstances that produced the Black Lives Matter movement, right? But I want to circle back to Yasmin and this notion of I'm not an American, because that resonated with me as well, and I very much view myself from that standpoint, right? And if we are to use Malcolm's interpretation or articulation of Americanism, you have to enjoy all the fruits of the American dream, as Jen Lin put in the chat, right? I would ask y'all, by Malcolm's definition, are you American? Not rhetorical, real question. If we are to use Malcolm's definition, and if you are to think about your life experiences, have you ever been foreclosed from the American dream? Yes, no, you don't know? Never thought about
it? In those terms, yes. Well, I'm sure most people would say yes. You're locked out of the American dream. If you're not locked in from birth, then you're locked out. But yeah, I've never considered myself, I don't look at any flags and think of any pride and never, no. If I'm going to put a flag up, it'll be the red, black, and green one.
Indeed. Same here, Jelani. At my house, every 4th of July, I'm hanging a red, black, and green flag. Juneteenth, my house has a red, black, and green flag. So I agree with you. But I think what this does, and the question that I pose, it problematizes notions of nationalism, right? Because typically when you hear nationalism and you don't put like the descriptive before it, black nationalism, whatever, nationalism, it connotates your nation, and in our context, America. Okay? Which moves me into my next question for y'all. Typically, when you hear these terms, nationalism, they have a negative connotation, right? When I think about nationalism, I think about the tiki torch folks with the khakis saying, "You will not replace us." I think about the folks storming the Capitol on January 6th. That's the type of nationalism that comes to mind when I hear nationalism, right? But Malcolm is doing something a little bit different with nationalism. So my question to you, when you first heard Malcolm's articulation of black nationalism, did anyone initially have a negative connotation in regards to it? No one thought about it? Okay, let's think about it this way then. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? Nationalism can be tied to patriotism, right? It can be tied to Americanism, which to me all fits aligned with the Tiki Torch folks and the folks who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, who folks you may call Trump supporters, right? folks that you may call conservatives, right? So what's the distinction between that version of nationalism and the nationalism that Malcolm X was talking about? Cassandra, can you kind of articulate deeper what you put in the chat? Because I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think that Malcolm was trying to like rewrite nationalism. I think he wanted to create a new form of nationalism, which was Black nationalism. That means like establishing a community with values that are not aligned with the previous ones. There's a moment where he says, controlling the economy in our community. If we own the stores, we operate the businesses, we establish industry in our own community, like creating a new community.
Yeah. Cassandra, can I ask you a question? What's your ethnic nationality or your ethnic identity?
My family's from Mexico and Argentina.
So would you say within your community, does your community spend money with your community? Does that make sense?
Yes and no, but mostly no.
Mostly no. Okay. Remy, what is your ethnic identity?
I'm Indian.
Indian. So would you say that the Indian community spends money within the Indian community?
No.
No. Okay. Ashlyn, what's your ethnic identity?
I'm Vietnamese.
Vietnamese. So would you say that the Vietnamese community spends money within the Vietnamese community?
Sorry, could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So let me put it to you this way: within the Vietnamese community, are there like Vietnamese stores that are owned and ran by Vietnamese people?
Oh yes,
Okay.
like there are like big communities like that, especially in like Westminster and like areas in OC. There's a lot of Vietnamese like areas, which is stores like that.
Are there Vietnamese people who are shopping and buying things in these areas?
Yes.
Okay, so that is Vietnamese nationalism, right? So Remy says yes and no, but by and large, no. So there's elements of Indian nationalism, right? Cassandra kind of had the same answer, right? But the same thing is no. So these elements of nationalism are already happening, right? But what Malcolm is pushing us to be more attentive and more focused and conscious about our nationalism, especially as Black folks, because I don't know if I could say it's myopic, the Black dollar circulating, right? We have little areas like Leimert Park will be a very small segment of the community, little pockets of Inglewood. I know off of like Fairfax, they have like Little Ethiopia. These are little pockets where you could kind of spend your money with your own, right? And Malcolm is pushing us to magnify this notion. So let's flip the question. Are there white-owned stores being operated and ran by white folks? Hell yeah, right? Do white folks spend their money in those stores? Hell yeah. Not only white folks, but everyone else, right? Everybody buy Gucci, right? Everybody goes to Albertsons, Ralph's, Vons, etc., 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 right? So this notion of nationalism is not an anomaly. It's not nothing that, hasn't been done before. But for some reason, when Black folks talk about doing it, it gets certain people up in arms. And I think it's a good theoretical practice to question some of these things. Cassandra mentioned the distinction in style between Malcolm X, or the approach is what she said, between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. We're going to get into that next week. Tidbit of information. I don't know if y'all into comic books or if you're into Marvel. If you are, if you heard of the X-Men, it's two characters. Professor X, who is like the leader of the X-Men. Magneto, who's like he's positioned as a villain, right? But that Stan Lee came up with those characters inspired by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. If you think about Professor X, he runs the X-Men, right? He's trying to create a world where mutants and humans are able to get along and live together. Martin Luther King is trying to create a world where black folks and white folks can live harmoniously. I have a dream, right? Think about Magneto. He like, fuck all that shit. Humans have been threatening to the mutants since the beginning of time. Mutants have an innate power in them that we're not using because we don't want to seem savage, right? Magneto like, yo, use your power to get yourself free. Malcolm X is like, yo, there's something in black folks. There's a power, there's a nationalism in black folks that's not tapped into. And if we tap into that, we could get ourselves free. So Stan Lee, the creator of Marvel, he's fashioning these two characters off of the two different approaches of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? So for next week's readings, we're going to kind of pick up on that conversation. And it's actually correct. Let me correct myself. It's not a reading. We won't be doing any reading next week. It's a speech that we'll be watching. So you'll watch that I Have Been to the Mountaintop by Martin Luther King. This is his last speech. It's going to sound very different from what you may be familiar with, very different from I Have a Dream. But if you have not watched Malcolm's speech, please go back and watch that, because a large part of our conversation will be a comparative between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And you cannot have that comparative conversation if you did not watch the speech given by Malcolm. But please watch it. Don't read it. Watch it, because I want to compare styles, okay?